Welcome to episode 34 of the Going for Broke Outdoors podcast, a podcast by an outdoorsman for other outdoorsmen. I'm your host, Jeremy Gillespie. On today's podcast, I welcome Andy May to the show. In this episode, Andy and I discuss gathering intel and assembling data into an actionable game plan. Andy elaborates on what it means to move in when the conditions are right, the importance of in-season scouting, setups for midday rut hunts, and so much more. This episode is packed with amazing stories from Andy's experiences in the field. But before we get into this episode, I want to mention that I have a new heavy metal themed design available in t-shirt or hoodies. I'll put a link in the description if you want to pick one up and help support this channel. Lastly, I want to thank everyone listening for the continued support. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or your favorite audio platform. And finally, I want to give a shout out to Uncle Lou at Stealth Outdoors for helping to make this podcast possible. Check out Stealth Outdoors at www.stealthoutdoors.com. Stealth Outdoors just released a new jacket and shirt in their innovative smoke camo just in time for the 2023 season. While you're visiting Stealth Outdoors, don't forget to pick up some climbing stick wraps, cam buckle covers, platform cable wraps, or stealth strip rolls for all of your miscellaneous silencing needs this season. Stealth your mobile hunting setup by visiting www.stealthoutdoors.com to silence your gear and place an order today. And now, on to the podcast. All right, today on the show, I'm joined by Andy May. Andy, welcome.
Hey, buddy. Thanks for having me. This is a long one in the making.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on, and I know you're busy, and we talked just before we got on live here that you've been a very popular guest, and sometimes you feel like there's not much left to say, but I'm going to hopefully ask some new and or unique questions and try to plumb the depths here and get some new information out of you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, I've listened to most of your podcasts, and you do a great job. I really enjoyed them. You're very thorough, and you ask great questions. So they're always very informative, very entertaining. So, yeah, man, happy to be here. Sorry we couldn't do it sooner. I was always trying to kind of give the podcast a break for a little bit and then do a fresh one with you, and it just couldn't make it work, but we finally did.
Here we are now.
Yep.
So, Andy, a little unconventional. I think the majority of my audience is familiar with you. You are, in my opinion, the man, the myth, the living legend. So let's skip the bio and let's get right into the meat and potatoes. What do you say?
That sounds good to me, buddy.
All right. One of my favorite analogies for deer hunting is that it's like poker. Both of these games are games of incomplete information that involve an element of luck. However, over the long term, skilled poker players and skilled hunters alike have far more success than those relying on luck alone. So today, that's what I want to focus on, the skills that lead to disproportional success. Okay.
Sounds good to me. I'm an ex-serious poker player, so I can relate a little bit.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, let's start out with something that both of those pursuits have in common, and I'd say that's critical thinking skills and assembling pieces of the puzzle from that incomplete information. So over the course of the year, or maybe even over multiple years, what methods are you using to gather this information? And most importantly, how are you integrating these various pieces of information into an actionable game plan?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Gosh, I'm kind of trying to gather information by any means necessary. I am constantly kind of on the search. I guess I was talking to a buddy about it the other day, and we were talking about how we used to hunt, and how we used to scout. We used to find a good area that maybe has some sign and kind of things that come together. And then we would prep a stand or prep a tree or mark that tree. And then we would come back, during season and hunt it and, find 30, 40 spots like that. And, we'd pull a nice, get a nice buck eventually, probably that year, just by being persistent and putting time in. But that's totally changed now. So now I'm constantly on the search for a deer, or an area that tends to produce a certain, age class of deer. And then I decide to kind of dive in and really learn as much as I can. So I spend quite a bit of time during, the late summer glassing around home. Around home, I have a good mix of kind of broken up country of some woods, some ag, some areas that are really heavy ag, some areas that are really heavy woods with secluded fields and whatnot. So glassing is a part of my process. It'd be hard for me to put a percentage on it, but definitely have picked up some deer over the years glassing. It just, my area sets up pretty good for it because I hunt in a pretty pressured area. The conventional glassing isn't quite as effective as really getting off the road or getting up in a tree or on a vantage or something where, I can kind of see into these little corners and these little pockets and these little low spots that you can't really see from the road. I think that's where I get a leg up on the glassing. It depends on the spot, but sometimes you can glass from the road, but a lot of time I'm trying to look into areas that aren't visible from the road. In addition to that, I do run cameras. I wouldn't say I'm a heavy trail camera guy. In any given year, I'm running anywhere from like 8 to 12 would be like a lot for me, depending on the year. And, I use those to gather information. Most of the time, I kind of use them in two different ways. So I'll start getting some cameras out now and trying to get more of like an inventory type thing, trying to just pick up a deer of at a certain age class or a certain caliber of deer that I'm interested in chasing, maybe trying to find, 1, 2, maybe 3, of something that I could target. And as we get closer to the season, really trying to zero in on, 1 or 2 of those to really go after early season. And then aside from that, the majority of my trail camera usage is kind of more of like a long-term play. I like getting them into areas and then kind of letting them soak most of the season, if not all of the season, without even checking them and getting the information that way. There are a few, 2 or 3, maybe 4, 5 sometimes that I have kind of maybe rotating through, get them on, a certain spot or a scrape or something where I can kind of tell what's going on like during the season, depending on the location. And I might check those periodically. There might be a situation where I have one more closer to a food source or closer to a spot where I can get in and out, not really booger things up. And I might check those more often. But I would say the bulk of the information that I gather that I think helps me is definitely, in person, boots on the ground. That's where I get the most confidence. A trail cam picture can give me a glimpse, but I like to, really get in there and see what's going on and get a feel for what's going on and kind of let my instincts, let my woodsmanship kind of take over. And that's where I seem to really get dialed in and get things done. I do a big portion of my scouting, when the season ends. I kind of get out there right when the season ends, when there's still snow, and really pick apart some stuff to kind of help me kind of get a picture of what was going on in the late season in some of these areas I hunted and see if there's some stuff that I missed. I'm not afraid to dive in and really figure out where these deer are bedding, where they're feeding, and maybe that'll help me, in a year down the road on a late season hunt. Just trying to gather that information. And then as soon as that snow melts, I'm out there again, kind of like phase 2 of postseason scouting. And that's when I'm just really diving in and really trying to really pick apart these areas, really trying to find beds, find trails, find that sign. And I feel like when that snow melts to right around turkey season, right around when turkey season starts, that window right there is probably where I gather the bulk of my information that I think helps me, especially during the rut. That's when I really can kind of pick apart that rut sign and kind of figure out areas where there were maybe some doe groups or good doe population and some bucks, showed up during that time frame. That's a great time to find, beds. And I do hunt beds, and I do focus on the bedding location when I can really narrow it down. Sometimes it's a specific bed. Sometimes it's more of a bedding area. Sometimes I just have the knowledge of like a bedding, a region, like a larger area, and I'm really trying to figure it out. But anymore, I won't go back and just throw a sit at that without some sort of confirmation. So during season, I'll go in there and try to kind of check that area, either with trail camera, either with glassing, or either with getting in there and really trying to see something with my eyes that tells me, this is worth a sit. And I think that's where some of my efficiency has really gone up over the years, is that I hunt a lot less, I scout a lot more during the season, and it leads to much higher percentage sits. So that on the boots scouting postseason is really important, but then I continue that right into the season, right up to the season, right all the way through the season is just lots of boots on the ground scouting and really trying to find something that gives me the confidence that it's worth a sit. So I have kind of morphed into this style of gather information, and keep gathering until I feel the confidence that it's worth a sit. And that gathering information is an accumulation of glassing, trail camera work, before season, trail camera work in season, boots on the ground scouting postseason, boots on the ground scouting in season, and really trying to come up with a game plan. And to take it even further, I've hunted a lot of years around here, and I've hunted a lot of years out of state in different areas, and I have a pile of experience and hunts to kind of pull from. And I've talked about this on other podcasts, but I've really kind of honed in, some really good early season areas across the U.S. really, and around home. And then also, some really good rut spots where I know even if I didn't scout a lick, I could go there, in November in Michigan and Ohio and Kentucky and Iowa and Illinois, and I can have a good sit and probably get an arrow and a good animal. And it's just from a pile of experience and years of doing that. And then when you really start to pay attention to this, I noticed that, certain areas tend to heat up during certain times of the year. And a lot of times that does revolve around like doe activity and the rut. But I've started to capitalize more on individual bucks and learning what they do and where they show up at certain times of the year. And again, once I start zeroing in on that, whether it's an individual buck or a certain area that gets hot, that leads to efficiency. So, I got a lot of things going on, kind of stirring in the pot that help, and that kind of I use, I guess, as my style of hunting. So it's really kind of hard to narrow down, one thing. It's ever changing, it's ever moving, it's ever evolving. But I'm always kind of pulling from past experiences, trying to tap into like that instinct of mine too. Like when I don't have things going on and maybe I'm not on a big deer and, some of these plans that I had or some of these areas I thought were going to heat up, maybe they're cold because of, increased hunting pressure or the buck I was after was killed or whatever it is. Then I really try to get in that search mode, that scouting mode, and just really try to follow my instincts and, get on something that way. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. Hopefully I answered that all right for you.
No, awesome detail there. And one of the things that I definitely want to get into a little later, and I'm going to probe some more questions there, will be in-season scouting. But a couple things I want to follow up on that answer you just gave. First of all, how often are you looking for deer that survived the previous season? And if you are, how is that different if it's a new to you, like this summer deer? So maybe talk about if you're looking for one that survived, and then one that's new to you this year. What are you doing specifically on that one new to you this year to get more intel without overpressuring that deer during the summer?
So like last year, if I'm just thinking around home, and for me, home is southern Michigan, probably, four different counties in southern Michigan and probably 2 to 3 different counties in northern Ohio. That's kind of my home radius where I spend a decent amount of time, and then I travel from there. So I don't have a really good, finger on the pulse of like what deer survived. I do know of a couple. I'm sure there's other ones that have, but a lot of these areas I hunt are small. They're all accessible to anyone, whether it's public land or if you just go knock on someone's door and ask, they'll tell you yes. I don't hunt anything that's exclusive at all. So a lot of times these areas, they're good for short windows. I might have permission on a 40 acres here. I might hunt this piece of public, but really the only good spot is in the far back corner, or this river bottom that's only good during the rut. It seems like because I don't have like one great big property that can hold deer all year long, I find that there's little windows where the action is good or these bucks show up. So I do have probably a dozen different bucks that I knew of last year that should be shooters this year that I am trying to locate, that I will be paying attention to those areas and trying to figure out if they made it. Now, the majority of them, no doubt about it, got killed. But I'm hoping 2, 3, 4 of those bucks made it, and those would be bucks that I should pursue this year, hopefully. So I'll be kind of keying in on those areas. If it was a deer that was around early season, I'm really going to focus on that, really trying to work that area with the glass or with the cameras, or walking some, depending on like if the food sources have changed or whatever, maybe I walk some field edges and look for a big track or something. Because a lot of times around, at least where I hunt, this broken up country that does have a lot of ag ground, sometimes these crop rotations can really change where these deer are. They're still probably in the neighborhood, but they might be a mile away, now on a different bean field, or a different cornfield, or maybe this woodlot that they were in early season last year was dropping acorns, and this year it's not. So, those things can kind of throw a wrench in it. It's not like they're showing up in the same, few acres every year consistently like that. So, I'll start to really zero in on those areas where I knew those bucks were at those specific times and kind of have that in the back of my mind, throughout the season. Now, if I were to locate a new deer, because I do a lot of searching in those weeks leading up to the season. Like I get cameras out now. I really don't start glassing probably, usually right around August 1st. That's kind of like, okay, I'm going to start driving around and covering some ground and see if I can get a glimpse of something. And if I do pick up something, I'll try to keep tabs on it. I might go in there and drop a camera like on the perimeter somewhere where I can go in like on a field edge scrape or something where I'm not going to booger that deer up, and just try to gather as much information as I can from my experience. Just because I locate them in August, even September, even mid-September, does not mean that he's going to be there for the opener here in Michigan, which is October 1st. In fact, a lot of times it seems like they relocate. But every once in a while they stick around, or they relocate a half mile this way or that way. It's usually not super far. So in a lot of cases, I can't, even if they disappear, I can relocate them, but getting access is the tricky part. So I don't get my hopes up with, that August and September glassing, but I really, really ramp it up about 2 weeks prior to our opener. And I do the same thing in Ohio. Once I start getting into that mid-September, third week of September, that's when I'm like really searching, because now I'm getting in that window where, just maybe they're going to be around for that opener and I might get a few sits. And how the way I gather that information, it just varies. Every situation is different. Sometimes, like in northern Ohio, some of these woodlots are so small. I can glass them. I can get out of the car, I can walk through a cornfield, and then I can see an edge of that woodlot where it can't be seen from the road, and I can glass and see if he's in there and if he's coming out or what deer are coming out. Another situation, if I knew a big buck was in there and he was the only mature deer I saw, I might feel comfortable walking an edge, walking a field edge and just trying to cut a track and see if I can find a fresh track. Either of those would give me the confidence, like, okay, he's here, this is what he's doing, and then I can form a game plan. And then obviously a trail camera in a key location or something might give me some info too. So it kind of varies situation to situation, but it seems like if I put in the effort those 2.5 weeks leading up to the opener, as far back as I can remember, at least 10, 12 years, I've had a good shooter buck to chase to go after opening day. And that's from the effort I put in, during that window.
One of the things that I learned personally from those GPS collar studies, and I think you kind of know it intuitively if you've been deer hunting for a while, but the early season bucks, they occupy a relatively, and it can vary deer to deer, but they occupy a relatively small home range early season. So if you're seeing one semi-regularly, he's usually real close around there on the opener.
Yeah, and it can be harder. Like I hunt a lot of river bottom ground, much more difficult to glass. A lot of times they're not making it out to the field before dark. I hunt a lot of swamps and marshes. In those cases, it's a little more difficult. I'll glass, especially in Michigan, I'll see these bucks in the bean fields surrounding the marshes in the summer, like in August, in July, maybe early August. And then guys just start catching on. There's a lot of hunters here. There's a lot of guys putting in some good work, and those deer feel it, and they feel the pressure, and they feel the cars stopping, and they feel the guys like getting out of the car and going up to the top of the hill and looking. And then all of a sudden you got pressured deer in mid-August, and they're already moving a little later, moving a little less, and not getting out to those spots till well after dark. So a lot of times you have to kind of anticipate that they're already kind of either moving later or even getting pushed back into those swamps and marshes. There's a spot on some public in Michigan that for a handful of years, I used to get so excited because I would glass these fields around this big marsh, and I would see 4 or 5 good, mature looking deer, 3-year-old, 4-year-old deer for Michigan, about as good as you could ask for on public ground. And I would get so excited. And I thought I was the only one that knew about these deer. And I was like trying to be incognito, glassing them. Well, by mid-August, everybody had seen them, and they were not coming out to the fields anymore. Well, I started pushing back further and further, like in my October hunts, and I got way back into the marsh, like way back into these really deep points that kind of went out into the marsh, and even these isolated islands. And I started finding some of these bucks that I was glassing in the summer. I mean, I'm talking a mile back, and that's how I started kind of keying in on those. I started to anticipate that pressure would push them back there. And then I started kind of hunting my way back. I would start at kind of like the likely bedding spots that were a little bit closer to the food source, but still a ways back, like maybe some points or maybe some islands that weren't as far back. And I would just kind of stage hunt my way back. And that's when I really kind of learned how these deer reacted to the pressure. And then I was able to get on some and even kill some back there in October. So that was a long time ago. But, those hunts, I can still pull from those hunts. I can still go back to those locations and, still have good sits. In fact, last year, Tethered they did a thing where they sent these young guys on a bus, like all over the U.S. deer hunting. And one of their stops was Michigan, and they came to an area that was like my home turf. And I gave one of the kids a tip, to go back into that marsh. And I was like, you got to be really quiet. You got to move slow, and he went back in there, and he said he busted a big deer off one of those islands. So, it's to this day, they're still being used, still producing. But, I hunt all kinds of different stuff. So it's really hard because I don't feel like I have like a dialed in system. A lot of it, like I said, it's kind of ever flowing and kind of go with my gut, but it does kind of revolve around as much as I can gathering information and then making like really good, like a detailed strike or a really specific sit for a specific reason, but as you get into the rut a little more, it might be, that's obviously, a lot of times it requires time in the tree, in a good spot. So maybe a little less efficient during the rut, for me personally, but then it's just about putting that time in those good spots and getting a crack at one.
Well, going with your gut, that's a good segue. You talked about how your previous experiences inform your game plan a lot of times, but what advice would you give to someone who is newer, who doesn't have a lot of experience to fall back on? If you can look back on those lessons you were learning maybe 20 years ago, what do you do when you don't have that built up knowledge base yet? How do you get there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always tell guys to follow their gut. Even if you're a new hunter, I feel like new hunters and guys that maybe have like, a year to 5 years, even 10 years of experience, they can like overthink themselves to death. They can go back and forth and waffle this and that and like, just overthink everything and make themselves crazy. My advice or my opinion is tend to play more on the aggressive side, hunt more on the aggressive side, and always follow your gut. If you get a gut feeling, go with it. And it doesn't matter if you're right. It doesn't matter if you're wrong, because what's going to happen is like, you're going to follow your gut, and it's either going to work out good for you or it's going to work out not so good for you. And if it doesn't work out good for you, that's information. That's an experience that you can now build from. That's an experience that now that gut feeling, those instincts might just change a little bit. Maybe I pushed in too far. I feel like I need to go in further. I'm not seeing the sign. I feel like I need to go in further. Well, there's a big rub right there. Oh man, I feel like I need to go in further. And then all of a sudden you bump the deer, right? So you pushed in a little too far. Maybe next time you follow your gut, you're going to pull from that. And it might tell you to, like, hey, I'm getting in here. The stem count's getting a little heavier. Sign's picking up. What's here? Okay, I got a scrape over here. I got a nice funnel. Let me look at the map. There's a little island, 100 yards ahead out in this marsh. I bet he's bedded there. So I'm going to set up here. I'm in undetected. He has no idea I'm here. I'm going to set up here, find a good spot. So you're kind of playing off those past experiences, but you have to kind of be more on the aggressive side, because you kind of have to push in and make those mistakes. And if you're a very timid hunter, and if you kind of read a lot of what a lot of the experts have written over the years, especially 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's like, don't ever spook deer, and don't leave any scent, and don't do this because you'll never see them again. Well, that does work, but it works if you can hunt a lot, and if you can kind of play more of the persistent, patient game, and then finally get a crack at one. But if you really want to tap into those instincts, you kind of have to push the envelope. You have to push in, and you have to make mistakes, and you have to develop those instincts. You have to make those mistakes, learn from them, kind of eliminate those mistakes or fix them, and let those instincts kind of take over. I also think over time that really kind of develops and can become a really strong asset, So I always trust my instincts, and they, every year they just keep getting more and more and more right. I'm getting in on deer, following my gut a lot of times. And when I'm at a crossroads and I'm not sure what to do, I just go with my gut. And sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, but more times than not, as I get older, as I get more experience, I'm subconsciously pulling from past experiences. And I've had so many that it's becoming right more often. But that started happening 10 years in. So guys can start trusting their gut and just know it's not always going to be right. And if you're making mistakes, if you're bumping deer, if you're in there mixing it up and you're getting encounters with good deer, whether you're spooking them or you're getting in bow range or you're missing them or they're smelling you, you're in the ball game. That's one thing about me is like, I am in the ball game with good deer all the time. Yes, I might be busting them. Yes, I might get an opportunity and I might blow it, or I might come to full draw and not get that chance, or, he might get downwind of me and smell me. But I'm in the ballgame. I'm getting encounters with good deer all the time. And I think it's because it's a combination of my aggressive approach while following my gut that I'm able to pull from a lot of past experiences, and really, really tap into those instincts. So I think too, if you get too set into like a style, like this is what I do. I hunt beds and this is the bed, and, I'm going to find the tree that's close to the bed or a scrape that's close to the bed. And this is what I do. And this is my approach. That's great. There's guys that do that. And I do that. I mean, I do that sometimes, but sometimes like throwing yourself into a new situation, a new area, a new state, a new type of terrain without a set plan and just going in there and just kind of letting your instincts take over. That's when you can really tap into what you have inside and pull from those experiences. You can be real biased hunting, the home farm over and over, and you can get real comfortable, or hunting, a handful of properties over and over, and you learn them and you know where the deer are and you have the strategy, and yeah, you can put some big bucks on the wall doing that. But I've always wanted to become a better bow hunter. I've always wanted to improve. I've never, ever it's never, ever been about just filling up a wall for me. Because if it was, I would hunt completely different than what I do. I would focus on drawing an Iowa tag. I would hunt Illinois every year. I would hunt Kansas every other year, and maybe go to Nebraska or something. And I would just put all my time, money, and resources into that, finding a lease, and I would stack giants. There's no doubt in my mind that I could do that. But that doesn't really excite me. I mean, I love big deer, but what excites me is new areas, new challenges, and becoming a better hunter. And for me personally, it's translated into like other species. Like, I think the best bow hunters are the hunters that hunt multiple species. And, specifically some of the Western guys. I think they are the best bow hunters. Hunting antelope, hunting elk, mule deer, bear, axis deer, you name it. Like, all of these animals are so unique and they're so challenging in their own way and require different skills for each one. And some of them are way more difficult to kill than a whitetail. But whitetail requires a different set of skill, that maybe some of those guys don't have. So I've kind of chose that route to kind of challenge myself across the board with a lot of difficult hunts and difficult bow hunts, because I feel like it makes me a better bow hunter. And I really I've really fallen in love with chasing some of these new species, because I'm kind of in that learning phase, and I'm in that phase where I'm building those experiences and really trying to fall back on my gut instincts. And, I'm finding that, I'm not awesome at it. I'm not the best at it. I'm not as good as I am at whitetail, but I'm pretty darn good at it. I've learned to kill, and I've learned to get in on animals. I've learned to create opportunities for myself, and I'm just learning the nuances of each of these species. But my advice, kind of back to the original question, for a new guy is be more on the aggressive side than on the passive side. If you're always on the outside looking in, you're never getting the encounters. You're never getting the experience that you need to really develop. You can develop on the fast track if you're a quick learner, if you eliminate mistakes, and you are on the aggressive side, and then you learn to follow your gut. That's the fast track to becoming a more deadly bow hunter, because you're going to be pushing the envelope. You're going to force these opportunities, and you're going to screw up time and time again, and you're going to make all these errors, and you're going to want to kill yourself some days. But you're going to be in the game much more often than the guy that sits the field edge, that doesn't want to enter his bedding area or his sanctuary, that never wants to bump any deer. That guy, he might get 2 or 3 encounters, a season on a good deer. Maybe, in a pressured state like Michigan, he might get none.
Yeah.
He might not get any. But if you hunt more on the aggressive side, and I'm not saying reckless, but more aggressive, push in, but be a predator, sneak in, be attentive, sneak in, look around, like pay attention to your surroundings, read the sign, but get into where these deer live and be more aggressive. And I remember when Dan said, if you're not bumping deer, you're not in the game. And it's true. You got to be in there. And that's the fast track to learning quicker, making the mistakes, learning more quickly, developing these instincts, and becoming a better bow hunter. I think a lot of guys never really tap into that. And it's because they're way too passive and they're way too cautious. There's been several times in the last handful of years where I just can't get anything going. I can't find a shooter buck. I can't, all these plans that I had where this buck was supposed to show up here during this time. He didn't show up. I have no idea where he is. He got hit by a car or killed or just somewhere else. I don't know. I'm glassing. I can't even glass up a 3-year-old deer. I start popping cameras out everywhere. I can't even get a 3-year-old deer on camera. It's like I've had multiple years like this in the last 5 years here in Michigan. And I just turn it up and I start really covering ground in the boots and try to bump something up. To me, it's not ideal to bump a big mature deer out of a bedding area, but when I don't have anything else going on, like that's as good as a trail cam picture to me. And now I bumped him, or I got into this area, I'm kind of burning through this area, right through the bedding area, and I start finding all this sign. Like now I'm in the game with something. And if I bump him, maybe I'm in the game with him. Maybe he comes back that night, the next morning, maybe he comes back a week later, or maybe I bumped him out for the season. But now boom, there's another piece of information, another deer that I wouldn't have had if I wasn't aggressive, and I can build on it. Either way, it benefited me. It might benefit me tomorrow when I kill him coming back. It might benefit me 2 years from now when another buck moves in and lives there. So I'm not afraid to go out and search. I kind of got that from talking to some other guys that probably had some strengths that were more weaknesses of mine when the years got tough. You know, I talk with Justin Wright, is a guy you've had on, and he's one of my close buddies, and we talk all the time. And, you know, that's what he does. And that's kind of what I started doing, 4 or 5 years ago, just taking a big loop through an area and trying to kick deer up. Maybe not try to kick deer up, but kind of work through an area where deer should be, where you think deer should be, where you think mature bucks should be, because we all know the types of spots that mature bucks like to bed, and go in there and see what you find. Maybe you kick one up. Maybe you find the sign. It's like, dude, I can set up right now, So I always go into it. It's not like I'm going through like a bull in a china shop, but I'm going in kind of ready to hunt. I have my bow, I have my mobile set up, and I'm slipping through, and I'm looking for sign. I'm getting in there thick, and yeah, I bump deer. I bump deer all the time. I was talking to another guy a few months ago on a podcast, and I was like, I probably educate more deer than any other hunter I know. I know I do, but that's because I'm in there constantly. I'm mixing it up with them, and I'm in there forcing these encounters because I want to gather the information. And if I do that enough, I either get the information I need for a good high quality sit, or I bump one that leads to a kill the next day, a week from now, or down the road, or it's a number of things. But by being in there and having that aggressive approach and kind of following my gut, and I'm able to pull back from almost 30 years of experience now. It's like I've developed a good feel for it. And even when I bump something or I find something, it's a lot of times I can capitalize on it then, or it turns into something good down the road.
Man, so many things that you said there resonated with me. And I just want to summarize a few of those, mostly because I think they're so important. First, you mentioned hunting more for adventure. And I think it's important to know why you hunt and to be honest with yourself. Like you said, your approach to hunting might look totally different if your only end goal was to put bucks in a record book, right? You might just lease premium ground and hunt the same rotation of stands every year. And that's fine, right? That's some people's what they like to do. I'm not making a judgment there. I'm just saying it's important to know why you want to hunt and to kind of craft your season and your approach around that. Second, trusting your gut. If a guy is paying attention, like you said, I think it's a self-correcting mechanism. You're going to get that feedback every time you trust your gut. Either it was right or it was wrong. And over time, it's kind of a iterative process. It's just going to correct itself. And I say this all the time. It's one of my favorite sayings. There's no replacement for experience. The more experience you get every season, the faster that thing's going to correct itself. So totally agree there. And then something you touched on, which this is newer to me, I'd say in like the last 5, maybe 6 years, aggression. And you mentioned Justin. I want to talk about Justin a little bit more here in a minute. But I think every time you sit back and you're passive, you have to wonder. You have to wonder every time, was that deer there? Did it skirt me? Did it go somewhere else? Was it even there? And I think so many guys are scared of bumping a deer, especially in season. But I'm a lot like Justin. And like I said, this is kind of newer to me the last couple of years. If I'm in a new area, like I had to relearn when I came to Montana, I didn't have any spots. If I'm in a new state, or like this year I'm going to North Dakota mule deer for the first time, I pound a ton of ground and I scout, and I kind of still hunt, but I just cover a ton of ground until I start running into deer, because especially out west, it seems like the deer are pocketed more. So you can waste a lot of time where there's no deer, or you can risk bumping a few and then get on the deer right away. So I think that's huge. And last thing he said, or one of the last things he said, talking about hunting new species, new states, I think that's super important for developing your overall bow hunting skills. And I laugh and I tell people this all the time. If you ever think you got something in bow hunting figured out, buy a archery antelope tag and do a spot and stock hunt, and that'll put you back to square one pretty quick.
Exactly. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Like, some guys don't care about becoming a better hunter. They want to manage their piece of ground, and they want to kill 180-inch bucks every year out of the same box finds, and they just get enjoyment out of working the land. And I see guys do that, and I get it. Who doesn't want a little slice of heaven where they can hunt giant deer? But I'm not super passionate about that. Like, I'd like to hunt that situation a little bit, but I'm really passionate about becoming the best bow hunter I can be and being effective across multiple states, multiple terrains. Like, you throw me anywhere and I want to feel like I can get it done and feel the confidence to get it done. And that's always been my goal and my approach. And yeah, I've killed a lot of nice deer, but I haven't killed some of the caliber of deer like some of those guys. But like you just said, you take some of those guys, and I'm sure they think some of them pretty highly of themselves, and you throw them out west and say, hey, go try to kill an antelope with your bow, or go try to kill a high country mule deer. I mean, they're going to fail miserably because it's a whole different skill set of bow hunting. And I am in love with bow hunting and becoming the best bow hunter that I can be. And there are far better bow hunters out there than me. And I've been able to help a lot of guys, and there's guys that have helped me, especially on the Western front. And I follow a lot of those guys and talk to them because they have a different set of skills than what I had coming into it. And, going out west and hunting antelope. I've killed 3 antelope with a bow, and I've killed 6 or 7 mule deer with a bow. Those skills required for those critters in those situations have helped me even more so on the whitetail front, because it's a whole different skill set, but I've been able to incorporate some of those back into whitetail hunting. So I hunt a lot more from the ground now with whitetail. I'm a lot more mobile, and sometimes maybe even a little too mobile, but I've enjoyed it. I've kind of gotten into a whole different strategy sometimes, much more confident still hunting with the bow. I call it like slip hunting, or I think Jerry Scheffler calls it snooking, sneaking and looking.
Yeah. That's a great term.
I mean, yeah, I love that. Like, my friends always, let's go snooking, but that's, I do that all the time now. And I feel like I'm scouting, I'm kind of slipping through the woods, and I'm looking, and yeah, ideally I'm trying to get eyes on a big buck. And that doesn't always happen, but sometimes I get eyes on deer that leads me to a big buck. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes I'm slipping around and I find the hot sign and I haven't bumped anything. It's like, oh my gosh, like, this is red hot. Like, I need to hunt this right now. Like, that scenario happens all the time. Or sometimes I'm slipping around and I bump a few deer, and then, that leads to other deer, and all of a sudden I'm in a really good spot. So that more kind of Western approach of like covering ground and looking for those opportunities or creating those opportunities, I've kind of incorporated that some into whitetail. And again, it's just helped me. It's helped create some more opportunities where before I probably would have been in a tree or in an observation stand or something like that, more stationary. And I still do all that stuff, but when I feel like being on the ground is more advantageous because I can slip around, maybe the conditions are good, maybe the terrain sets up well for it, I have all the confidence in the world to do that now because I've proven to myself I can sneak up on antelope with a bow and get an arrow in them, which is, as you know, one of the hardest things to do.
Yeah, it's an exercise in frustration. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And I've never heard a mechanic complain that they have too many tools in the toolbox. And I think when it comes to bow hunting, the only way you put that tool in the toolbox is to get out there and practice it. Like, there's really no shortcuts. So the more you practice those skills, especially like you said, things that you're uncomfortable with, the sooner that weakness becomes a strength. And then you got that tool in the toolbox for the rest of your hunting journey.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, Andy, here's something I hear a lot of big buck killers say, and I feel like this thing isn't fleshed out too well. I hear him say something like, quote, I moved in when the conditions were right. And while I know that can be highly situational and pretty dependent on your area, could you think back and maybe give me some specific examples from previous hunts and elaborate on you moved in when the conditions were right? What those conditions look like, and what cued you in, hey, it's time to make a move on this deer in this area?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you could use that term with a lot of things. I've moved in when the conditions were right I think back to, and you wouldn't think that this would be good conditions to move in on a certain buck or a certain area, but this big mature Michigan 9-point from, I don't know, it's probably been 8-9 years now. But I wanted to get back in this stand, and it was back in the timber more, and it was pretty. There was lots of like high stem count. It was kind of thicker type wood. There was a lot of that ash tree that kind of had fallen, so a lot of sunlight was getting in. So it was real thick back in the timber more, much thicker than like on the wood's edge, kind of around the perimeter. But I never felt confident that I could get back into, it was a specific tree. I never felt confident that I could get in there without alerting everything, in the area, because I'd have to walk through so much timber and crunchy leaves and sticks and just be noisy. So it was mid-October. I can't remember the exact date, but I got like a windy and rainy day, like blustery wind, blustery rain. And I was like, dude, this is perfect. I'm going to sneak back into that. I'll be able to just move like a snail and get back into that timber and finally get to hunt this spot. And there were a couple different bucks that were kind of living back there that me and my buddy knew about. One of the which is the one I ended up shooting. But I snuck in there with those conditions, and I got in completely undetected because the noise and because the leaves and everything were wet. I could move completely silent. So I just moved really slow, kind of moved with the wind gusts, finally got into that spot. And when I climbed up in that tree and finally started seeing a few deer move, I was within 40 yards of deer that were bedded. So those conditions allowed me to get into an area that I otherwise would never have gotten into undetected. They would have heard me coming, a twig break or a leaf crunch or something, probably, well before I even got close to that tree. So that's one that sticks out to me. Another one is, I think, probably the traditional, when guys say that, they're probably referring to this situation, which, I've said it a lot too about certain hunts, but moving into kind of a traditional rut spot. Maybe it's the downwind side of a doe bedding, or maybe it's a funnel connecting a couple bedding areas, or an area where a lot of points kind of dump down together, just something that pinches movement down, where buck movement tends to gravitate when they're really cruising or on the search for does and waiting for those perfect conditions. So you're waiting for that perfect time of year, right? Which could be late October, more likely, probably more that first week of November, kind of heading into that second week or something. And then you're waiting for that time frame. You're waiting for the perfect wind to get in that to get into that spot, which, obviously you prefer to have it blow into some sort of like dead zone or an area where you don't expect deer to be coming and going. And then if you can time that with some cold weather, like, maybe a drop in temperatures, or maybe just below average temperatures or whatever, when it accompanies that time of year. I used to be more attentive to the moon. I do think it has a bit of an effect, but I don't really pay attention to it much anymore. But like that, there's a situation right there where there's multiple things kind of lining up together, certain time of year, certain weather temperature, certain wind direction. And if you've had the discipline to stay out of those areas until that timing is right, until those conditions are right, you're going in with a very high chance of success. So a lot of these situations where you wait till the conditions are right, you have to exercise some discipline in waiting for those conditions, waiting for those rainy or windy conditions to get into those more sensitive areas where you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get in. Or, it could be complete other end of the spectrum. You got a water hole and, it's hot out and you're waiting for some really hot weather or drought type conditions or the perfect wind to sneak into something like that. It's more being disciplined to move in when everything is right and in your favor, so you can get that first effective sit. That very first time in, we all know that's your best chance. In any situation, that's probably your best chance, because no deer have detected you yet. Anytime you sit a spot over and over and over, it's degrading. Some more than others. Sometimes you can find a really good situation where maybe you have water access or something, and you literally just climb out of the water and up into a tree. But even then, a doe picks you off because you're moving, and she blows, or something. It's usually something happens where every sit after that, it's degraded a little bit. So that would be, when guys say that, those terms, waiting for the right conditions, I mean, those are the things that come to mind.
No, those are great examples, and I think they tie back into kind of what I wanted the theme of this podcast to be. You got to think critically about that, and something that we touched on quite a bit here, your accumulated experience. You're thinking about when is the optimal time to be in there, or that from previous experience. And then something else you mentioned there, and I don't think this is talked about all too often, but great point, is discipline. And man, that was a tough one for me early on, and now it's much easier to remember. A lot of these spots are only great spots during a certain window, and if you get in before that window, that's an undisciplined move that's really messing up your chances of success in those areas.
Yeah, there's several times throughout the season where I'm waiting for the conditions to be perfect. There are those situations for me. But there's, on the whole opposite side of that, there's times where the conditions aren't perfect and I'm still going out there trying to make something happen. There's a lot of times I go on these out-of-state hunts and the conditions are not perfect. For instance, like last year, I went on a Western hunt. It was a mule deer hunt, and I went out there and the conditions were the worst I've ever been in my life. I mean, it was 60-mile-an-hour winds. I've never seen anything like it. I had a hard time walking without getting blown off my feet or off balance. And it was like that day after day after day. And I was like, I'm not going to be able to, even if I did see something, nothing was moving. But even if I did see something, like, how am I going to shoot my bow? Like, I won't be able to even hold my bow steady. Even if I get an arrow off, it's going to be blowing my arrow sideways. I just felt like the chances of this hunt being successful were about as close to zero as you could get. But then me and my buddy were just like, you know what? Like, we're not seeing the deer. The deer are here. We got to go lower. So we started going into like more badland country. And we're looking, we're kind of looking on the leeward side of these hills and in these little cracks and crevices. And it's like, no, we got to look lower, like the lowest spot that they can get where we can't see unless you're looking straight down. And we started kind of peeking around and looking down in these badlands, in these cracks. It got to the point where we started finding deer, but you couldn't see them until you were within like feet. Yes, you might be over them, but like you were within feet of them looking down, and they were tucked in the lowest possible elevation, hidden in these little tiny cracks out of the wind. And it was incredible. It was so cool once we started figuring that out. So then it was like, okay, we're starting to find deer, and this is the strategy. We have to like look over these cracks like there's going to be a big buck every time we peek over. And, we might look over 100 of them, and 99 of them, there's nothing there. And then there's that one, and there's a deer there. And if you're not careful, because when you're looking over, you're skylining yourself, boom, they see you immediately. So it's like we started, instead of like, I think I described it as, instead of like spot and stalk, we were stalking to spot, essentially reversing it. So we were stalking to these little spots where we could just peek over, and we're looking for an ear, an antler tip, like anything we can see before we completely skyline ourselves. And we came to this new area, and we got up on this big vantage, and we're looking down over all this badland country, and we're kind of working this edge, this rim, and we get to this point where we can see a lot of really good country. And there's this little tiny point of view where I could see down into these badland, these like little like drainages and these little washes. And there was like this little narrow point of view that I had that I could see right to the bottom. And all I could see, I'm like glassing, I'm really picking apart, and I'm looking as low as I can. And I just see this left side of an antler. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a nice buck right there. And like, I couldn't have been standing anywhere else than where I was to be able to see like through all this different elevation. I could just see through these multiple cracks, and I just see a left side of an antler way down at the bottom. And I showed my buddy, and he's like, "Oh man, yeah, that's a pretty good one." And we were happy with it considering how the hunt was going. I mean, he wasn't a giant, but he was a good solid deer. And the stalk was on. And now I had found one. Then I had obviously the wind, the very high winds in my favor to get down there. So the stalk was not super challenging. I just had to stay out of his view for the most part. And then I got to, I knew I had to get close. I didn't even want to take a 20-yard shot. Like there's just no way. The wind was blowing that hard. So I ended up getting right about 10 yards from him. And I was able to draw back and put a good shot on him. But
that's awesome.
That's a good example of when, sometimes you just got to go with the cards that you're dealt and try to make something happen, even though the conditions aren't ideal, because a lot of times we don't have that flexibility to just sit and wait for conditions to be perfect. I mean, I'm a perfect example of that. Like I have days, sometimes I have a little flexibility, but a lot of times these are the days I have to hunt and I got to make something happen, or I got to try to gather some information or something that's going to benefit me either now or, a few days from now or a week from now or later on.
Yeah, it highlights the importance of a couple things. One, being persistent, and two, being resourceful, right? Like it'd be easy to get there and, having a positive attitude too. Be easy to get there, like you said, and be down in the dumps or give up on the hunt because the conditions are so bad, but you're already there. It's like, make the best of it.
Yeah, we had some guys that were with us that pulled out. They decided to leave because the wind was just too much, and they were going to come back at a different time. So it just goes to show, like you can get the poorest conditions, but you can turn it into a positive. And with that one, it's like, okay, those terrible conditions, those super almost dangerous type wind conditions, pushed the deer down to very specific locations, and they were hard to find and they were hard to see. And there had been major droughts all through that area the last few years, and the deer numbers were way down. So it's not like we were finding a lot of deer doing this, but we found out what the pattern was. All we needed to do was find the right one. And now the wind was an asset to us, because now the stalk, which often is one of the trickiest parts, that was the easiest part. And because the wind was so strong, one of the things I had to do, or I wanted to do, was get in super tight, and it allowed me to do that because the wind was whipping so hard. I probably could have went up and just touched that deer on the back of the head. I mean, that's how hard it was blowing. But I knew I had to get close to get a good clean shot in there. But yeah, I mean, it just kind of using those poor conditions and turning it into a positive saved that hunt.
And that story is a great transition to something else I wanted to talk about. But before we move on, I want to take a minute to mention huntingbeastgear.com. Co-founded by the big buck serial killer himself, Dan Infalt, Hunting Beast Gear features state-of-the-art manufacturing techniques, the highest quality materials, and innovative designs that have been engineered, field-tested, and refined to perfection by a group of the best mobile hunters on the planet. www.huntingbeastgear.com delivers cutting-edge products, including Beast Gear climbing sticks with weight reduction holes designed to deliver incredible durability in a lightweight stick. Beast Gear climbing sticks also feature non-staggered, inline stacking, and double steps, all in a 2.2-pound package, including the fastening strap. HuntingBeastGear.com has also released the game-changing Beast Gear Hang-On Tree Stand. Designed to be the ultimate hang-on tree stand solution, with over 4 years of prototyping, testing, and refinement, the Beast Gear stand features a 16-inch wide by 29-inch long platform. The stand comes in at an incredible 6.8 pounds, and it does all that without compromising strength or durability. The Beast Gear stand is finished with a long-lasting anodized coating and features grade 8 hardware, high-quality Delrin washers, Beast buttons, and adjustment knobs. For more details and to place your order today, head on over to www.huntingbeastgear.com. Now, back to the podcast. We touched on early in the podcast here in-season scouting, and it sounds like you listened to some of these episodes, but I did 2 episodes with our mutual acquaintance, Justin Wright, who personally I consider him to be an expert on in-season scouting. So this is kind of a 3-part question. If we want to circle back to any of these parts, let me know. But first one, and we kind of covered this already, but when are you employing in-season scouting? Sounds like pretty much all the time. 2, more specifically, this is the 2 and 3 are what I'm more interested in. When you're doing in-season scouting, what are you looking for? And then 3, how do you balance that in-season scouting and applying too much pressure?
Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah. So number one, I'm in-season scouting all the time. Kind of like, as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to gather information to the point where I have enough that I feel like I can go in and kill something. And if I don't have that, I just keep trying to get it. So I need to see something, I need to get eyes on a buck. I need a picture. I need some hot sign. I need to bump into something along those lines. Maybe a good sign coming out of a bedding area, a big track, some big rubs. Like, I'll probably go in there, and sit. If I know a big mature deer, the sign left by a big mature deer, and maybe I see that deer and he's not something I want to arrow or something, and that's totally fine. But I'm always looking for enough information where I feel like 50 to 60% or higher, I can go in and have an encounter with that deer. If I don't have it, if I don't have like that level of confidence, maybe even a little higher than that, if I don't have that, then I try to gather more information to get that, or I go start searching somewhere else. And then when I do get it, that's when I dive in. And the only caveat to that, I would say, is like during the rut, then I'm probably going to be just putting in time where I know there's either a shooter or 2 or, a couple of deer that I know I'm interested in. I know they're in this area during the rut. Then for me, it's about putting in time in high percentage locations and being there as much as possible. But even then, I'm usually trying to, if it's around home, I'm trying to put myself in a position for a specific deer or, a certain caliber of deer that I know are in that area. And then out of state, it's a little different. But number 2 was, remind me again.
What sign are you looking for? And then how are you balancing the pressure?
Yeah. So number 2, I kind of just answered that. In-season scouting, for me, it consists of kind of glassing. I don't do a lot of glassing like in season, but I'm always glassing. I'm always looking. I always have my binoculars, checking some trail cameras in certain locations. I'll do that. I don't run a ton of cameras, but I keep moving them around. If I have 5 or 6 or 8 out, like I'll move them around a little bit, but I'm not one of those guys that puts out 60 of them, and I just start checking cameras. I don't do that. And I don't really care to do that. Like, I like using them as a part of my process, but I don't want it to be live and die by the camera. Like, I don't want that. I don't like the way that feels, because there's been a couple of years where I felt like I almost felt like, gosh, I can't get anything going. I just need more cameras out. And I was just checking cameras, and I was talking to Justin about it. I was like, dude, this sucks. Like, this isn't, I'm not even good at, like, I'm not even doing what I'm best at. And I just completely abandoned that and started doing what I felt like I was best at, which was getting on the ground and getting in there and mixing things up and finding something. And that's when I, ended up getting my opportunity. So getting eyes on a deer, a picture of a deer, or it could be just the sign. It really depends. If it's earlier in the season, mid-October, I'm really kind of looking around those likely, bedding areas that we all know bucks like to, especially mature bucks like to bed in. If it's a marsh, I'm kind of working that marsh edge, where the marsh meets the timber, and I'm kind of working down that transition line, and I'm looking for sign coming in and out. Just anything, a big track, some rubs, a good scrape with a big print in it. Some of those antler ticks, where a lot of times, Justin and I have both seen this, where I think it happens a lot, where you get deer where you don't have like a whole lot of competition, and there'll be a mature buck in an area and he's not shredding it up because there's not a whole lot of competition. He doesn't really need to do that, but you'll find like these little antler ticks, just little ticks from the tips of his antlers, like almost like little holes in the trees. And we've both found those quite a bit. It seems to always lead to like a good mature deer. But I think it happens more in areas where you don't have as much buck competition, so they're not really in there thrashing it up. But normally around that time of year, early, mid-October, maybe even to that late October, I'm kind of just working around those bedding areas, around things or areas where I think a mature buck should be, Maybe I'm going off something where I knew where one was last year, and I'm kind of working that area to see if I think he's back, if there's sign that indicates he's back. Maybe check at a camera if I have one in there to see if he's back. Or maybe I'm just going to a completely new area, like I did with my my Michigan public land buck a couple of years ago. I went to a completely new area. It was mid-October. It was October 19th, and didn't have anything going, couldn't get anything going, had no bucks to go after, and went to a completely new spot. I snuck in, and I found this little opening, and there were some white oak trees there, and I started like glassing up in the tree, and I saw that there were a few acorns left, and I started looking on the ground. There were some browse. I found some poop, and then all of a sudden I started finding all these like really torn up scrapes, like active scrapes, probably a half dozen or more, all under these oaks. And then in a few of them, there was like some wet spot, and there was some good sized tracks. What I thought was like a 3, maybe a 4-year-old buck. And I was like, wow, this spot is red hot, and normally, just given the layout of that situation, there was good perimeter cover around. I felt perfectly fine sitting there. It seemed like a spot that could be visited during daylight, but the way the wind was blowing, and when I looked up on my map on my phone, I was like, I bet you there was this, I don't know, maybe a 5 or 6 acre kind of thicket just next to that, like just adjacent to it. And to me, that looked like the only good bedding cover around. The rest of it was just timber and kind of wide open. Like there was a river bottom through there, but it was kind of like flood ground. So it was like, you could see through it, kind of open.
Yeah, not where you find a buck that size in Michigan.
Right, exactly. When I was looking at that map, that thicket made all the sense in the world because it was really thick, dense cover, kind of overlooked. But my wind was blowing right in that direction. If I were to try to set up in there, it was kind of blowing in that direction. I thought if a buck did come out and had that direction towards me, he would win me. So I backed out away from the sign. I did a big loop and came in on the opposite side of that thicket. And I snuck into the thicket. I got right to the edge, and I started sneaking in, and I bump a doe, like immediately. I take that back. I find a spot. I get in probably 20, I don't know, maybe 20, 40 yards into that thicket. I find a nice tree. I start climbing up in my saddle, and it looks good. I get up high enough where I can kind of see into a decent area. I'm up above the vegetation a little bit. I have some shooting holes. And then as I was pulling my bow up, I hit a branch or something. I didn't think any of it, but I was trying to be real quiet because I'm in what I anticipate is this buck's bedroom. I got the wind in my face, and a doe must have heard me hit that branch. And as I'm pulling my bow up, I get it, and then I'm, kind of getting it all hung up and everything. And I look, and there's a doe walking right at me, coming to check out what that noise was. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I'm on the opposite side of the tree. I'm in a saddle. So I'm on the opposite side of the tree of her, and I'm just hiding behind this tree. And I'm like, oh my gosh, please don't bust out, because
Right.
This is a very small thicket. Like if she blows, if she takes off, whatever's in that thicket's going to hear. And she loses interest. She comes, she checks it out, doesn't see anything. She goes right back about 80 yards away and lays down. It was awesome. So then I'm I'm ready to go. And now I'm on the opposite side of the thicket, on the opposite side of where that sign was. So I felt if the buck was in there, he really had no reason to come my way. Okay. I just felt there was crop fields more that opposite direction where that sign was. That's where all the sign was. I felt like just naturally he was probably going to go that way. And in that thicket, when I got up in that tree, there was this little island of trees. I mean, 1/8 of an acre, a little, just tiny, the size of a very small house, 1,000 square foot house, little island of trees. And I was like, I bet he's bedded right in there if he's in here, because it just made sense the way it was kind of laid out. But because I thought his natural movement was going to be away from me, I felt like I needed to try something that was maybe a little unconventional. So what I did was, I was like, okay, I'm going to wait until prime time. If I don't see him, I'm going to call. And the reason I felt somewhat confident calling is because I had entered this this deer's bedding area. I got in undetected. I did something that a human technically shouldn't have been able to do, right? Like, this buck feels secure. It's a good buck. He's bedded in this secure spot. He's supposed to be able to detect if he hears a human rustling through the weeds and the branches and stuff.
Sure.
And then he can escape. But because I snuck in there, I got in there undetected, I felt like I got a decent chance of getting this buck to kind of explore this sound. So what I did was I waited till about 30 minutes of daylight left, prime time, when other deer naturally would be moving anyway. I didn't want to do it 2 hours before dark because that's not very realistic, like a deer grunting and, rattling or whatever. So I waited till prime time. Things started getting a little dark, a little calm. And I pulled out my grunt call and I tried to turn my head and I tried to cast it away from the deer. So a lot of times, I'm not a big caller, but sometimes when I call, I'll try to make it sound like it's coming from a different direction. So I wanted to sound like I was possibly further than where I was, because the way the wind was blowing, usually, mature deer especially will kind of come in downwind. They'll try to circle downwind of the noise. So I was trying to call out further away from where I thought this deer was bedded, in hopes that when he did make a circle, it was within bow range and not out of bow range where he would smell me, if that makes sense. So I did a little,
perfect sense.
I did a little burp, a couple like that. And then I took my rattling antlers and I just started hitting branches, just light, just, like a buck's in there. He's in his bedding area and he's over there and he's just making a little rub, nothing like two bucks clashing, no big fight. It's mid-October, and it's Michigan, that's just probably not going to work. So I just, clacked it on some branches and stuff, made it sound super realistic. Didn't hear anything, didn't see anything. But from my experience, especially in Michigan, is a lot of times when you call, you don't get that immediate reaction because they've been called to a lot in most cases and they're just super cautious, and it's not Iowa. So what I have experienced is sometimes these bucks will come and investigate later. Like, they hear the sound, they didn't forget it. If it came from a spot that's, where it's likely a deer would be, a buck would be, that's realistic to them. If you didn't make some drawn out monster buck clashing fight and you made it sound realistic, it just adds to the realism. So I waited, and about 15 minutes later, I hear a buck in that little island of trees, and he's making a rub. So I hear branches, and I'm like, oh my God, he's in there. And, keep in mind, I have no idea what this deer looks like, right? All I had was sign of a big track. There were some rubs, but they weren't overly impressive. But I've seen nice bucks, make medium-sized rubs, even small rubs. But the track itself is what I keyed in on. So I hear him rubbing, and he sounds like he's kind of fired up. And then I hear some footsteps, and it's wet, it's kind of wet in there around that little island. And I hear, like water. And then I hear a snort wheeze, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like he thinks.
And he's coming.
Yeah,
in.
He thinks there's a buck in here. He thinks there's a buck in his bedding area. So next thing I hear is just step, step, step coming my way. Occasionally he stops, rakes a tree, and it's just every step is like a little slosh because it's kind of like wet, like I don't know, like a couple inches of water. And he's coming my way, and I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go. So I grabbed my bow, and I was like, I gotta see what he is. I've got to see what he is. And he kind of steps out, and I see like this really cool, unique looking rack. He's got a really nice side on one that's just like a perfect 4, like a half of an 8. And then the other side is just this kind of weird, webbed, non-typical thing. And I was just like, yep, I'm shooting him. It's like, yeah. I didn't have to take even a second look. He was super unique, awesome public land deer. And there was just no doubt about it. So didn't care about his age or anything like that. It was just like, heck yeah, man, this is a freaking awesome hunt. So he comes out and he steps out in the open and he's looking around, and I'm just waiting. I get a good range and kind of where I think he's going to go. But he did exactly what I thought he was going to do. The way my wind was blowing, it wasn't blowing towards him, but it was blowing like off kind of to the side. And the way he exited his bed and the way he came into me, he did a moon shape and tried to get downwind of where he thought that call was made. And the way it worked out is he did that moon, but he didn't get quite downwind to me, but he did just about get downwind of where he thought that sound was, because I casted it kind of more upwind and tried to make it sound like it was more away from me. So I didn't like point the grunt call right at him, like right at him where he could really pinpoint it. I casted it more upwind, and I tried to sound softer and further away than what I really was. And I got to think that helped, because the way he came in and he circled downwind, he ended up right in my lap with like a 23-yard shot or something. But he turned broadside, I drew my bow back, settled my pin, and put it through both lungs, heard him crash. And he was super cool. One of my favorite deer. I mean, one of my favorite hunts too, because I remember Justin and I both, we were like, we do this. Are you familiar with the app called Polo?
I am not. Okay.
It's an app where, you turn it on, it's a video, right? And you like him and I are always driving. So it's like, boom, you're just talking. It's like a video message essentially. I mean, you could do it on text, but it just lives on Polo.
Okay.
And we do that back and forth, like talking hunting, like all the time. And him and I had been complaining and bitching about our, situation, and he can't find a big deer in Missouri, and I can't find a big deer in Michigan, and we're just like being crybabies together. And, and then this happened, right? And just completely turned the season around. I ended up having an awesome season after that, but it felt so good. But that's a perfect example right there of how in-season scouting and just diving into a completely new area, finding what I was looking for, checking the layout of the land, looking at the map, seeing the wind direction, and trying to come up with a plan of where I thought, this deer is and how I could, tackle the situation. Now I could have just backed out, waited for a better wind, and came back and hunted where all that sign was. I mean, that is an option, but the sign told me, it was so fresh that some of those I think 2 of those scrapes had piss in them. I mean, like still wet, damp spots.
That's the night before the morning.
Exactly. Yeah. So, I knew he was there. I knew he was close. And then just kind of knowing what we know about mature buck bedding, the thicket made the most sense. It was the most secure, the most dense cover, and kind of overlooked. So, yeah, man, it worked out. It was a super cool hunt, and kind of felt like I made something out of nothing with that one.
No, that's one, an awesome story, and 2, perfect illustration of, like you said, what in-season scouting can do for you. Again, kind of on the theme of this, right? Use some critical thinking. You made your best guess based on the map and what you had available where that buck was bedded. You knew what his likely route of travel was based on that white oak that was still dropping, but knew for that wind you had to get somewhere else. And the calling, kind of unconventional, like you said, in Michigan especially, that I'm with you. That's a tactic that's much less likely to succeed than it is, but I think how you went about it. And John Eberhardt, and this is going to be a transition into the next topic I want to talk about, but John, if you've read his books, and I'm sure you have, or I know you've talked to John a bunch.
Yep.
I think he's a big proponent of the light calling, like the tine ticking, the soft grunts, especially in Michigan where the deer are just so call shy that it seems like if it's going to work, that's usually how it works.
Yeah, for sure. I have talked to him quite a bit about it. In fact, he's in the middle of writing a book, and he had me write a couple stories, and I wrote about that story.
Oh, that's awesome.
Because that story is a perfect example of, in-season scouting, calling to pressured deer, and then really about how I used the wind, in my favor, to make that hunt successful. Because he, obviously he doesn't really pay attention to the wind, but he knows I do. He knows that I believe that the wind in certain situations puts deer in specific spots. And that's why I pay attention to it, because I think it puts deer in my lap. It puts them likely into certain spots, because of that wind direction, because of where that thermal pull or whatever it is. And that's why I pay attention to it. And he wanted some of those stories in the book, so I wrote about that one. But he was telling me last season, I think he rattled in 16 bucks.
Oh, wow.
In Michigan. And he said all of them were 1.5-year-olds, except for he did shoot one of them that he thought was 2 or 3 years old. But so yeah, I mean, you can do it, and it typically does not. That buck I shot, I'm fairly certain was probably a 3-year-old. I don't know for sure. Like some of my buddies saw it and they thought he was 4, but it is uncommon to call in like a mature, like 4-year-old plus deer. I mean, in Michigan it's tough, but where I was and the way I went about it and the fact that I had kind of intruded into his bedding area, it probably made him real defensive and more likely to come check it out, because I got into his lair, so to speak, undetected. And normally a human wouldn't be able to do that, but a deer could.
Yeah.
So it just added to the realism.
Great story. Really good story. Well, being a Michigan guy, I know you're obviously familiar with John's tactics. We talked about that. One of the things that I know about you and in prepping for this podcast is that you've had a lot of success on good bucks on midday hunts in November. So in terms of terrain, what are your go-to setups for that type of hunt? And when are you accessing those areas? Are you coming in way early for an all-day sit, or are you coming in like after the does have bedded down for the day?
Yeah, I've had a very high success rate with midday hunts. And just like John says, like proportionally, the amount of all-day sits I've done, the percentage where I've killed it is quite high. I've killed some of my biggest bucks right smack dab in the middle of the day, between that 10:30 and I'd say 3:30 time frame. My biggest buck ever was November 5th at 3:30, like 3:25.
Is that the 2006 buck?
Yeah, 2006. Yeah, he scored. It was the biggest buck in the state with a bow that year, 172, and he's super cool.
If you could maybe tell that story, because obviously that was a midday buck, and that might be a great way to illustrate the point.
Yeah, well, that one was a little different because I was hunting in a completely different county. That day, it was November 5th. It was my birthday. I was in a completely different county in one of my favorite spots, this river bottom that typically just heats up during the rut. I mean, it's full of does. If you go there early October, mid-October, there might be a couple of young bucks in there, but it's predominantly like doe groups bedded all through that river bottom. It took me a while, but what I learned was, like, if you stay out of there and leave those does alone, you're in for a really good late October and first 2 weeks of November. So that's what I did. And I snuck in there, and I was going to sit all day. And I got into this tree. You kind of go along the river. You can use river access, and it's one of those spots where you can get up, crawl up the bank, and you're right there at your tree. So it's pretty bulletproof if you play the wind right, if the wind is good. And I got up in that tree, and I was sitting there, and I don't know, around 9:30, 10 o'clock, the wind started to shift a little bit, and it started to blow me out into the river bottom as opposed to across the river. And, I'll sit it out for a minute when wind starts to shift like that. But if I look and it's like, okay, we're really getting a big wind shift and it's going to be consistent, I'll get down. I don't want to burn it out. I'd rather just get down and live to fight another day. So I get down and get back to the car, and I start thinking about where to go. And I remembered, because I keep a journal of all my hunts. So I have every hunt documented since 1997. The year prior, on November 4th, I had an encounter, an hour away from where I was at, with probably a 140-inch buck in this one spot. And I never saw him before. I never saw him after. But I knew a guy down there, and he worked at the steel factory. And he said all the guys from the steel factory would see this big buck, and they called him Big Mo. It was like the nickname. And I told him about that deer, and he's like, yeah, I wonder if that was Big Mo. And, it was just kind of like legend deer down there. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to drive down there. I saw this deer from then. I saw this deer the year prior on November 4th. Why wouldn't he? Perhaps he's back in that area again for the rut. So hadn't really hunted down there, didn't have any cameras down there, nothing. So I drove down, took me about an hour to get there. And at that time I was using a lone wolf on sticks. So I started out with the lone wolf and sticks, and I went out and I started just kind of working through that area and covering some ground and just kind of trying to scout the edge. And I came to this spot, this corner where this was right around this was like noonish. And I come to this corner where there's a big standing cornfield where it meets a corner of a woods and then a corner of like a overgrown, like set aside field. So it's kind of where all those three meet right in this corner. And I see three like massive rubs. To this day, probably some of the biggest rubs I've ever seen in Michigan. And they look shredded and there were scrapes all around. And I'm like, holy cow, this is some really big buck sign. So, this is back in my experimental days. This was a small piece that I had permission to hunt. So did several other people. And, I wasn't parked far away. So I actually had my decoy in the back of the car. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to set my decoy up in this overgrown field. And it was at a time where I was trying everything. I have never been one to this is my style and this is what I do every year and this works out and this is how I kill my bucks. I'm always trying new stuff, and I was especially like that even back then. So I went back to the truck, grabbed my decoy, and I'm thinking middle of the day, this is still kind of fairly early. I mean, I've been hunting for a good 10 years, but I had killed a couple midday bucks, but I wasn't that worried about kind of going in and out. It's the middle of the day. It was whatever. So I went back and got that decoy, set it up kind of upwind of me in that overgrown field. I climb up into a tree and I'm sitting there, and it was about 3 o'clock. I sat there for about an hour. Nothing happened. And I get my, this is funny because I end up calling this buck in too. But I grab my rattling antlers and I start rattling. And this time I'm making more of a racket, more of a fight. It's November 5th, you know what I mean? So I'm being a little more aggressive. And I have had some success, killing some, early on, some 2 and even some 3-year-old deer calling. I hadn't up to that point killed what I would consider a mature deer in Michigan doing that, but I had killed some nice bucks, bucks that were good early on in my career. And I start hitting these antlers together, and all of a sudden I just hear this eruption in the standing corn. And what I think that buck was with a hot doe. This is my opinion, because this is the only thing that made sense. I think I was really close to where that deer was, and all of a sudden he hears a couple bucks right there in his zone, and I think he was in there with a hot doe, because I hear these corn stalks just erupt, and I'm grab my bow, and all of a sudden I look and I just see these antlers materialize out of the standing corn, and it's all of a sudden he just locks onto my decoy, and I'm like, holy shit! It was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. He locks onto the decoy and he stares at it for 30 seconds, and then all of a sudden he just starts slowly marching out to it. And I mean, just like you see him do with a decoy. I mean, he comes right downwind between me and the decoy and gives me a 15-yard shot, and I ended up killing him. So that's how I killed my biggest Michigan buck right there is using all the stuff that should never happen in Michigan. I'll tell you what, that deer and that hunt ruined me for 5 years, because I thought I had it figured out. I thought you just use the decoy and you just smash the antlers together every time, and you're going to kill some giants. And I never did again with that strategy. I mean, I've killed them with a decoy and I've killed them rattling, but I thought hey, this is possible, so I started doing that more and more, and obviously didn't have much success with it.
Hindsight being 2020, and obviously since then, all the Whitetail Adrenaline DVDs have come out, and Jared's kind of made that a science. But I mean, I'd have to think you're exactly right, given that exact situation. Probably a hot doe in there, and it's just like most calling, right? If you find a buck that's in the right mood or receptive to it, it works. And when it works, it seems like it works phenomenally, but most times it just doesn't work.
Right. I think that's what made that situation. I think I was in his bubble, and I think he had a doe, and he heard some bucks, and he was fired up already, and he had to move 25 yards to see what it was, and he just poked his head out, and boom, there's an intruder staring at, right there, staring in his face.
Yeah.
And it's just like it just happened to work out. So I don't think that's a great example of like my midday sits and my midday hunts, but mainly what I'm looking for, like on a midday spot, I'm looking for something that has a lot of things coming together. A lot of things going for it, compounding features. A couple spots that come into mind. There's a spot in Illinois. It's on some river bottom ground, and the way the river bends in this certain location, it creates a funnel. On the west side of this funnel is a clear cut, and then on the east side of this funnel is kind of like a big chunk of timber it's got good young growth in it. I mean, it's got big trees. It's just a good chunk of timber that you can't see through. I mean, so there's plenty of understory, plenty of, browse and good thick bedding thickets and whatnot. And then to the south of that river bend was another clear cut that was older. So like a much more grown up tree, high stem count, held a lot of does. So right in that location, I had clear cut of more of a more recent cut, but was grown up like over my head growth. To the south was one that was probably 5-6 years older than that. Both of them very good bedding. The one actually has some really good food in it because it was still a good height where deer could feed in it and bed in it. And then to the east was that, just that big giant chunk of timber. And then the way this river served as, a good travel route and bedding area along the river bends and whatnot. And then it bended right there in between all those three. And then right where that river bend was a crossing where they could travel north to south, like right across that river. It was just beat down. So right there, I had all these things that are attractive during the rut, good doe cover, food, multiple bedding areas for does and bucks, and it was the rut. And that was a spot where I just had a lot coming together, and I had a lot of success right in and around that area. Me and a couple of my buddies had. So, I would sneak in there personally. I would get in there early before daylight. I always tried to, at least in that location, I tried to get in there while I thought bucks were still out feeding. And deer were still out feeding. I like to get back in the timber and get in that stuff and get settled in and then just let everything kind of come back through. There was another spot down in Iowa where it was a little more hill country. It wasn't like real steep hills, but it was significant hills. And there was a spot where all these ridges that kind of dumped down into one bottom. Like if you looked at it, on a topo, you'd have multiple like secondary ridges dumping down into the same general location. And what would happen, like when bucks started cruising, they would come, up and down these points, and everything kind of crisscrossed right down in this bottom. And because the bottom it wasn't a real tight bottom, it was kind of like a wide bottom, maybe 70, 80 yards wide. And then there was a big hub scrape right down there, kind of where all those secondary ridges dumped down into that same kind of general area. So I hunted there a few different times, and I drew Iowa. I've drawn it several times now, but there were 2 times in a row, like 1 year and then like 3 years later, where I killed a mature buck on the very first sit in that spot. And then I actually killed a buck. My buddy went in there the very next day and shot one that was like, I don't know, it was very big. It was a big non-typical. He thinks it was like in the 180s, and he hit it in the shoulder.
Yeah.
But those are 2 really good examples of spots where I think it's worth an all-day sit. And some might argue like it's not worth sitting in one spot, daylight to dark. And I get that. There's some spots where it might be good in the morning, maybe even late morning, midday. And then, towards the evening, you got deer kind of more working away from you. So you might be in for like a poor evening hunt. You might want to relocate to something that is more closer to food. There's certainly spots like that where you can still hunt all day, but you might want to kind of relocate for that afternoon sit. But those spots, I felt like the one, especially the one in Illinois with the clear cuts, there was food around, with those clear cuts. There were deer kind of bedding in it, feeding in it, kind of crisscrossing all through there, through that river bottom right where I was and crossing that river. So I felt like food was around. So I felt like that was a kind of a high percentage sit all day long. But there are certainly situations where it's not like that, and you might want to kind of relocate. But I have always been more of the type to get in there real early, before it even starts cracking light, if I can. I'm not opposed to coming in at gray light, especially if I think like it's a situation where, maybe I don't have as long of a walk and I feel like I can get in quieter and maybe bump less deer if I come in at gray light where I can kind of see a little bit, or maybe even where I don't have a specific tree picked out yet. Maybe I start my trek in the dark and then I kind of get into where I want to hunt at gray light, and then I can kind of really see like, okay, this tree is best, instead of like trying to climb up and, to some tree I've never been in pitch dark, and then it gets light and you can't shoot anywhere. I've done that.
Yeah. That's always a fun experience. Yeah. Like, what am I doing now?
And then you tear down and, you got to set it back up anyway. So I definitely have done the gray light thing, but if I have a tree picked out, like if I've done my scouting for some of these rut sits, in both of those scenarios, I had scouted thoroughly. I didn't necessarily have a tree prepped, but I had a tree picked out, and I could go in there with a saddle or a light hang on or whatever and get up in a tree. But those are kind of two classic examples. Another one is, I talked about it earlier in the hunt, or in this podcast, I'm sorry, but that river bottom that gets really good during the rut. There's a spot in that river bottom where everything pinches down, between the river kind of comes up close to a road and there's some fields, some ag fields kind of outside of that creek, outside of that river bottom, and everything pinches down. And it's a great all day sit. I mean, it's fantastic because you got the ag fields around, but the deer are moving up and down that river. The bucks are moving up and down that river bottom all day long because it's loaded with doe. They're bedded everywhere through there, in little pockets, and they're all spread out. So it's a great all day sit, and you don't have to move and you don't have to relocate. So, it's just finding those kind of magical spots that are good. But I've killed a pile of bucks midday, and it's hard. It's hard to sit, but I don't know, man. I have some friends that have like tried it like a dozen times and they never see anything midday, and I just don't. I don't know. I don't understand, because I can't really think of too many sits during the rut where where the conditions were good, where it was nice and cool and the movement was good. Where I haven't seen some action. And a lot of times I feel like I see good bucks move at midday. I feel like it's sort of a big buck, mature buck trait where, a lot of times they'll come in and they'll bed down and then they'll wait for a lot of the does to get bedded, which sometimes can be, 9:30, 10 o'clock even when you start getting into November. And then they get up and then they make the rounds, and they're real efficient with their route. They don't want to be cruising all day long, but they'll do a quick, efficient check of all these doe pockets and these doe bedding areas. And I've seen them do it. I've seen them do it out in a marsh. I've seen a big buck get up, and he was probably close to a mile away when I first saw him. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. He worked through this marsh. He started about a mile away, and within like 5 minutes, he was 50 yards away from me. And what he had done is he had went through this marsh and went downwind of every single island out in that marsh. And he did it so efficiently and so quickly. And just like that, he was just disappeared. But he had checked that whole marsh in roughly 5 minutes. And then he was just gone. I mean, he just bedded somewhere and just disappeared in the cattails. And it was so cool. It was peak rut. And I mean, that told me right there, it was like, man, they are so efficient. But he did exactly what mature bucks do. You know, he let the does bed, he got up, made a quick route, and was super efficient with it. And then he either bedded down or, you know, he went to a new area and did the same thing. I don't know. I just lost track of him, but it was really cool to see that. But that's a mature buck behavior. So if you're not there to capitalize on it, you're missing that. I think bucks in general do that, but more times than not, when I see a deer cruising kind of midday, it's usually a good buck.
Yeah, and that's the point I was going to make is I think I've got friends, like you mentioned, that have tried it, can't get behind it, and it's very unconventional, I think, in comparison to the rest of the deer season. You don't see many deer because the only deer you typically see are breeding bucks. And it's not like, especially in Michigan, there's a ton of those, but it's one of those things where if you put some faith in it and do it a few times and you're in the right area, I mean, and you gave some great characteristics of what that right area looks like, a lot of converging terrain features, something that could be a bedding and maybe like a browsing feeding area. I definitely agree on all those fronts. If you're in the right area that time of year and you do it a few times, it's definitely a productive tactic. So want to get one more thing on that before we move on. You mentioned November 5th. That's your birthday, and you killed your largest Michigan buck. So obviously that's one of the days you'd be doing a midday sit. Give me one or two others. So if someone's listening and they haven't got on the midday hunt train, November 5th would be one day to put on there. Give me two other ones.
The very next day, November 6th, it might be hard to believe this, but I've killed 5 or 6 bucks on November 6th. And I'd have to look back, but I want to say like 4 of those were in kind of those midday hours, meaning after 10, before 3. I feel like anywhere in that window, and I do use that kind of November 5th as like a starting point. I've killed them midday on a Halloween. I've killed them midday on November 2nd. But for some reason, it kind of seems like, you know, that November 5th through 12th time frame, you know, even into the, you know, November 15th, you know, even in Michigan, like that kind of opening day gun. I mean, things get really shut down there, but I even see good midday movement then. What I do tend to focus more on as we get into more of that mid-November, more of that kind of peak rut where most of the big bucks are locked down, you know, where those big ones just aren't on their feet. They're not covering ground. I tend to sneak more into those doe bedding areas, get up high, sit all day, you know, because somewhere where you can see far, like those river bottoms, some of those marshes, those can be really good. And you're not necessarily capitalizing on, you know, this big 4 or 5 year old buck, like covering a mile. But what I've witnessed and what I've had success with is like, you see this big buck out there with a doe, you know, and they stand up and they don't stay bedded all day. Like that doe is up, you know, he's getting a little too close. She's not quite ready. He's bumping her around a little bit. She smells good. So other bucks are younger bucks are kind of moving in. Then you see the big guy stand up and kind of walk this guy off. It's like, that's what you're trying to see. That's what you're trying to capitalize on. I shot a real big buck in Michigan last year, real big one. And that's exactly what he was doing. You know, November 15th, he was out there in that river bottom system, and he was with a hot doe, and I was sitting up high and it wasn't quite midday. It was more late morning. But if I had sat through the midday, like, and had not shot him, you know, he would have been right out there midday, moving around and bumping that. He wasn't really bumping the doe around. What happened was there was other bucks kind of creeping in a little close, and then he'd get up and he was kind of standing guard. But, you know, that can give you a really good opportunity to sneak in close, reset up, you know, go in for a stalk, or maybe you can kind of see where they're trending, where he's pushing her to, or kind of general movement, and then you can relocate and get in front of it. Or if you anticipate where she's going to go to feed later or something like that, can lead to a good hunt. So as I get more into that mid-October, I really try to gravitate more towards those doe bedding areas, or towards those areas where bucks like to push does, as opposed to like kind of trying to capitalize on those longer travel route funnels, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and it's funny because it proves how drastically things change in the deer woods. It's like my observations are real similar to yours. that first flurry in November, like you said, 5th to the 10th, 5th to the 12th, that same kind of activity where you're seeing that frantic search for the, where the big wave of the bell curves of the does are coming into heat. And then when you get kind of that peak of the curve a week later, it's different. You got a lot less of that seeking, running long miles activity and a lot more of that localized, where a buck's got a doe locked down in a breeding area. Yeah. Hey, Andy, we're running up definitely on time here. Well, I want to say two things. One, appreciate all your time. It was a pleasure to get you on here. Like I said, long time coming, but definitely worth the wait. I think there's a ton of valuable information. I do have one more question before I let you off the hook, and this is something I like to ask everybody. So quick one here. If you're looking back now, I think you're mid-40s, early 40s. If you're looking back to 18-year-old Andy May, give him one or two tips that are going to increase his success the most, and then give him one or two mistakes to avoid.
Yeah, I would say 18-year-old Andy, explore more areas. I think, 18, 19, 20-year-old Andy had 2 or 3 spots, that he kind of focused on, and then he just kind of hunted between those. And I killed nice bucks back then, but I killed the best bucks that those areas had to offer, at best. And a lot of times, those weren't fully mature deer, obviously. There were some 2-year-old deer and maybe occasionally a 3-year-old deer, but a lot of like 100-inch deer or something like back then, that a lot of times was the biggest buck in the area or the biggest buck on that piece of ground that I could find. And that's what I killed. So I was a little more narrow focused then, but understandably, because I was a newbie.
Sure.
I would tell Andy to explore way more areas, spread that net out further, and inevitably find some better deer, the wider you spread that net. I've always been a real intense scouter, even back then, maybe even more so back then. So that's what I would say. And then the other one was what mistakes to avoid, right?
Yeah.
I would probably would teach young Andy the correct way to shoot a bow. It's weird. I picked up a bow. I've told this story, but I picked up a bow and became obsessed with archery. Like, I love archery. Like, if you took hunting away, I would still shoot my bow. It's like a form of meditation for me. The more I practice, the better I get. I see those results. And I was quite good with a bow right from the bat. I got in some leagues. This was down in Jackson County. And if you know anything about Jackson County, the hunting culture down there is really big. We got one of the biggest archery shops in the whole state of Michigan. They ran these big leagues, tons of killers down there, really good, experienced bow hunters. And I come in as a complete new archer and just torch everybody, shooting these really high scores. And I'm just naturally good at it. But I was shooting the bow completely wrong, punching the trigger, not realizing that I was developing some really bad habits. Yes, I was super accurate. I didn't know any better, just using a terrible release, bad form, and just punching that trigger and hitting the middle. Well, yeah, I started killing some deer, and then I missed some deer, and then I wounded some deer, and just thought, like, man, this is tough. I need to practice more. So I'd practice more the same way, develop more bad habits. Then I'd kill some deer, then I'd wound some more deer, then I'd miss some more deer. And it was just like, man, okay, I got to practice more. I got to practice further. So then I started backing up to 40 yards, 50 yards, 60 yards. And now it's like you start shooting long range while you're trying to punch the trigger, and your perceived movement at those longer distances, that pin is really dancing around because now your target's further away. It looks smaller. So the perceived movement of your pin is even more. And now it's like, oh man, that pin is like, it's on target, it's off target, it's all over the place. And now it's like, I got to time it right when it hits that spot. Boom. So then now I'm practicing these bad habits even more so, because I feel like if I could shoot, at 40, 50, 60, it's going to make these 20-yard shots even easier. And theoretically it should, if you're not punching the trigger and developing the worst case of target panic known to man. So what I was doing was really practicing, really bad form, really bad shot execution, and just totally ingraining that into my shot execution. And anytime I was put into a high pressure situation, like shooting at a big deer, more times than not, I'm not hitting exactly where I want to aim. I still killed a lot of deer, but I had a lot of gut shots, a lot of liver hits, some through the lungs, some were perfect, some wounds, a lot of misses. I did that for years and years, where out of every 10 bucks I shot, I was probably recovering 6 or 7 of them. And then out of those 6 or 7, I probably gut shot 4 of them. So I was having my buddies out, leaving them overnight, trying to find them the next morning, and then yes, we'd find them. And then I started to figure out, like, okay, I got a problem here. I got some really bad target panic. Got really bad for a couple years, where I was missing like multiple big deer, and I just had no control of my shot. And that's when I started doing the research, figuring out there's lots of guys that have the same issue as I do, sought out the proper, resources, and there's people out there that kind of helped me figure out, diagnose what I had going on. And then I did the work to fix it and learn to properly shoot a bow. And, now things are much better. Not that I'm like cold as ice. I still get nervous. I still get riled up even after all these years and having a lot of success. I still get super excited. But now I'm able to execute a much more calm shot, a much more reliable shot. And I don't punch the trigger anymore. So a lot less wounded deer, less missed deer, usually shorter track jobs. So that's probably what I would probably tell a young Andy to get his stuff figured out a little quicker.
Yeah. And I think it's funny because I think the more excited deer hunting makes you, I mean, a lot of guys will say, oh, I never had target panic, or I never get buck fever. I mean, I don't personally believe that. Maybe that's the case, but I feel like the more deer hunting gets you excited, the more susceptible you are to that. And everybody's got to go through their own journey to get through that. I've done the same thing, missed deer, wounded deer. It's like, you got to figure out a way to execute a shot under pressure, and everybody gets there a little different, but that's all I had, which I say that's all I had, but we're going on 2 hours here. So I want to thank you again. Great content, a lot of obviously super informed answers from a place of a lot of experience. So appreciate your time, Andy. And last thing, if people want to learn more about you or read your articles, what's the best places to find you online?
Thanks, man. I appreciate you having me on. You do an awesome job. Really easy to talk to. You ask some great questions. So really fun conversation. I have a Instagram account. I post some stuff on there. It's Bow Hunting Dad. I have been working with a company. It's called Hunt Better. It's www.huntbetter.us. And I've been putting some content on there, but it's an awesome resource, an awesome learning resource. There's some cool sections on there. One of them, which is Break Down the Hunt, where guys like me, some other really good killers, Justin Wright is going to have some stuff on there. He's got some stuff there on there already, but some really accomplished hunters where they kind of break down specific hunts for deer that they think are kind of a good learning opportunity, where we break down the maps, what the deer did, what the hunter did, why he did what the conditions were, wind direction, all that stuff, and try to make it a very good learning experience. There's cool sections, one called Conversations, where 2 real experienced hunters just sit down at a campfire and just talk for hours and hours and hours, and the thing's recorded, and wherever the conversation goes, it's just kind of just a natural conversation between guys with a lot of experience, maybe some different experiences, and a lot of knowledge shared there. Among other things, there's a field guide where me and guys like Steve Shirk and Rendell Eric and Nathan Killen, guys, public land killers, where they kind of take you along on their scouting missions, and they film little clips of what they're finding, why it's interesting to them, how they read the woods, and kind of just document their process of scouting and preparation and things like that. So there's a lot of cool things, a lot of new things coming. But the reason I decided to be a part of that was because the thing that Hunt Better is trying to focus on is woodsmanship and trying to preserve the culture of woodsmanship. So you won't be hearing a ton on technology, not a lot on trail cameras. I mean, we all use trail cameras, yes, but the focus really is more on reading sign, developing instinct, reading the woods, knowing your food sources, knowing how deer utilize terrain and different types of areas and different parts of the country. And it's really focused on preserving that culture of woodsmanship, because I think we're getting away from that somewhat these days. You know, if you watch a lot of these shows and a lot of social media, it seems like anymore it's a lot of cell cameras and a lot of more surveillance, you know, at a food source or a corn pile and food plot or something like that. So, which is fine, you know, it's legal, and if guys are doing that, they're having a blast, and I'm happy for them. But I personally feel kind of pulled in a direction to kind of help preserve what got us here, you know, as hunters, and what it means to be a hunter, and to have those skills and those woodsmanship skills. I don't want those to be lost, and I feel like they need to be talked about and stressed and preserved. So that's what Hunt Better is trying to do, and hopefully a lot of exciting things coming down the pipe with Hunt Better. So happy to be a part of that. So you can check that out too.
Awesome. Well, hey, Andy, thanks again, and really appreciate the time. Good luck this fall, and we'll be following along.
All right. Thanks, buddy. Appreciate it.